Someone who just returned from Russia is former UN weapons inspector Scott Ritter, who was just in Moscow, saw firsthand these attacks, literally in Moscow and around. Scott, great to have you back on the show. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
So when you hear this, I mean, you've seen the increase of militarization from Germany, from Western countries, European countries, what the UK is doing. What is the mood or sentiment like inside of Russia? Do they truly believe, like the EU is arming themselves for a direct confrontation with Russia?
Well, I visited two Russias. I visited St. Petersburg and Moscow, and I also visited the Donbass, Lugansk, Donetsk, and Zaporozhye, which is the front line. And there's, I guess, two mindsets inside St. Petersburg and Moscow. What we're witnessing is a major information warfare operation being run by the West using Ukraine as a proxy. These drone strikes against, Moscow, St. Petersburg, against Voronezh, against other facilities, they're harassment. The idea that these strikes are, crippling Russia, crippling the Russian economy, demoralizing the Russian people is absurd in the extreme. I was in Moscow the day that 500 drones came at them. You have this very dramatic explosion and things in the air, and the Russian people just get on with their lives. There's literally no major impact on them. Their morale is very high. There are some on the left in Russia who feel that Vladimir Putin's inability to respond decisively, is a sign of weakness, and that Russia must end this war to the point of accepting the fact that they won't have all of the territory of Donetsk under their control. There are others on the right who believe that Vladimir Putin's pragmatism is a sign of weakness, and that Russia must double down and go for the decisive victory. With all due respect to the people that live in St. Petersburg and Moscow, you don't count. You're a bunch of academics. You're a bunch of elites, and I don't think Vladimir Putin listens to you at all. The people that Vladimir Putin listens to, of course, are the people that live on the front line. The soldiers that are doing the fighting. They're winning, by the way. They're winning decisively. They're threatening to capture Slavyansk. They're going to take Kramatorsk before the summer is over. They've just taken another third town in that urban belt. When that happens, the Donetsk falls, and all of it will fall under Russian control. And when Donetsk falls, Zaporozhye front will fall. And so the Russians are winning on the front. It's a very hard fight. The Ukrainians are flooding the zone with drones. These are drones that not only murdered 21 innocent teenagers, students at Starbell's College, but these are drones that continue to attack civilian infrastructure and vehicles in the strategic highway that connects Mariupol with the Crimea. It's very dangerous to travel. I traveled on those highways, came under drone attack. It's there's no. You can't diminish what's happening. I mean, you can't pretend it's not happening. Gas stations are closed. There is a gas shortage. Melitopol was without electricity and water. And one would think that this would break the spirit of the Russian people living there. And the answer is hell no. They're as determined as ever to keep fighting. They will fight. They understand that victory is theirs. That what's happening here, these Ukrainian drone attacks, is just psychological warfare operations. It's very bloody. They are killing a lot of civilians. As you see, they destroy military infrastructure. But while this has complicated logistics, it hasn't stymied the Russians. The Russians continue to, advance decisively. They have other ways of getting supplies to the front. The other thing I like to point out is it's not just German and British support that's making its way. It's American support. The drones that attacked me were American-made Hornet drones, or drones that were made by a company funded by Eric Schmidt, the former CEO, founder of Google. Eric Schmidt, if I ever meet you, I'm going to punch you. because you tried to murder me, and you are culpable in the attempt on my life and the life of everybody else. You're committing terrorism. The last time I checked, that's a violation of law, federal law and international law, and you are you're providing material support to these terrorists. You know that your drones are being used to attack civilian targets. You know this because the AI chips that you put into it basically, spend the first, I think, 80% of their battery power looking for pre-programmed military targets. And then when it comes down to 20% of them haven't found a target, it goes into free kill mode. That means kill anything and everything. The strategy is to drive civilian traffic off the highways so that the only thing ostensibly on the highways would be by default military traffic, which would be struck. But the law of war doesn't allow you to do this. And so Eric Schmidt is a war criminal. These Hornets and other drones are being guided through the use of Starlink terminals. So Elon Musk is a murdering sack of horse manure. And they are murdering children. They're murdering innocent civilians. They're committing war crimes as we speak. But no, the people of these regions, their resolve is unbelievable. I've never been more impressed with a collective people than my entire life. These are people that, they haven't been at war for 4+ years. They've been at war for 12+ years since 2014. This is nothing new that they're going through, and they are proud to be Russian, and they are determined to be part of a Russian victory that means that the totality of their homeland becomes part of Mother Russia.
And one thing that I can't get from news coverage and social media is what's it like for these towns once Russia continues to move the front line? I mean, we all live in a town. Imagine what that's like is you don't live in Ukraine anymore. Now you live in Russia. And what is the either support or opposition? Because we know that most of the people in those regions did, in fact, vote in the referendum over 90% to become a part of Russia. So in these new towns, is there resistance? Is there acceptance? What do you think? Were you able to see that when you were there, or at least understand some of that temperature?
Yeah, I visited first of all, I have to say that I got close to the front on a couple of occasions, but the Russians were insistent that I be allowed to leave the territories alive. It's very dangerous at the front line. And there's no driving around, there's no, war tourism. When you get close to the gray zone, the drones are flying, and if you don't take the appropriate precautions, you're going to die. I traveled to Gorlovka, which is a former frontline city that's still under tremendous attack. And I also went to refugee camps where the Russians who are in these villages that are being liberated are rescued and brought to these camps. The Ukrainians call them zhdun. It's a pejorative. It means the waiters, those who wait. And these are basically people who say that we're Russian. And when the Ukrainians start to withdraw, they say, no, we're staying, we're not evacuating. And so the Ukrainians basically target them. They use them as human shields. They keep them in homes. It's complicated. It's the Russian advance. People keep saying, why are the Russians advancing so slow? Well, first of all, war has changed. The drones are everywhere. You just don't get to play the game you used to play. It's a different war, slower pace war. But the other thing is that when the Russians are liberating these villages, they literally have to clear each building with the understanding that there could be civilians in the basement hiding. Otherwise they would just do what America did in Mosul and Raqqa and elsewhere, just flatten the entire city. Makes life easier when you kill everybody. But the Russians don't operate that way. They go in, they find these old people. I was in this refugee camp. It's tragic. They're being well taken care of, but they all had similar stories, how they were in basements for 20, 30 days. The Ukrainians would laugh at them, wouldn't let them get food, wouldn't let them get water. If people venture outside to get food and water, they were killed by the Ukrainians. The bodies left to rot. They would have to go out and bury the bodies at night. When the Russian soldiers finally arrived, the Russian soldiers would, of course, start evacuating them. And the Ukrainians would attack them with drones, with artillery, with mortars. And these elderly people, they're all, people in their 60s, 70s, some in their 80s, would break down and cry and tell us, how the Russian soldiers literally covered their bodies with their own. And many of the Russian soldiers were wounded because of this absorbing fragments that were meant for the old people. Some of the Russian soldiers died. Russian soldiers literally gave their lives to rescue these Russians who said they want to be part of Russia. They want to live in Russia. Sadly, there's still a large number of people trapped in the front areas, including large numbers of children who it's very, because of the drones, it's just very difficult. It's easier to resupply them in place than it is to try and evacuate them. But no, it's very difficult. The Ukrainians use these civilians as human shields. They fortify these towns, and the goal is just to make the Russians fight for every square inch, and to try and get the Russians to kill civilians so that the Ukrainians can blame it on the Russians. But the bottom line is the Ukrainians are slaughtering these civilians by the hundreds and the thousands. It's just an act of war crime. There's nothing honorable about the way the Ukrainians are fighting this conflict.
What about the cost of death on the Russian side? There's obviously numbers thrown around. You heard from David Petraeus, who says that Russia can't really go on with this anymore. Listen to General David Petraeus today. Listen.
It's extraordinary. They're outnumbered 5-1 in terms of personnel, 12-1 in terms of the economy, and yet they are taking the fight to Russia on the front lines, on the Black Sea, in the depth of the battlefield, and in the Russian Federation itself. And over time, Vladimir Putin is going to eventually look in the mirror and say, I'm not only not going to achieve my immediate objectives of control of all the provinces that I've laid out, Donetsk, Luhansk, and others, I'm actually going backwards, and the casualties are so high that we can't sustain this. Again, they've taken more killed and wounded than the U.S. took in all of World War II.
All right, so a lot of things to unpack there, Scott. Putin's going to look. David Petraeus apparently knows Putin very well. He's going to look in the mirror and say one morning, I can't go on anymore. So he knows him very well on that front. More killed and wounded than the U.S. has sustained during World War II, and that Ukraine is taking it to Russia, even though they're outnumbered 5-1, and it's really crippling Russia right now. Three things there that sound like a big pile of bullshit, but...
Yeah, well, Petraeus is just full of it. So is anybody else who embraces that. First of all, the Ukrainians have more troops in the special military operation than the Russians do. The Russians have around 700,000 troops. The Ukrainians have around 800, 900,000 troops. Now, many of the Ukrainian troops are poorly trained and they're getting slaughtered. But the idea that that Russia outnumbers. Now, the Russians are able to put more infantry into a given area because the Ukrainians today, because of the casualties they're taking, they're emphasizing drone troops. They use the drones to create these screens, massive waves of drones, et cetera. 80,000 drone operators in place. That number's shrinking every day, however, because the Russians hunt them down and kill them. But there's rough parity in terms of overall numbers. The Russians are able to mass infantry better. But again, when I say mass infantry, these aren't human wave attacks. Drone warfare makes that impossible. You're looking at the Russians coming in 3s and 6s and 9s. These smaller assault groups supported by drones and supported by precision artillery. This is the way the battle's fought across the front lines. The Russians have taken very heavy casualties. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about this. But it's hard to calculate them, because to give you an example, almost between a quarter and a third of the overall Russian death count will be attributed to Wagner forces who, used prisoners in literal human wave assaults back in the 2022, 2023. Four of the major battles fought by Wagner, they lost between 50 and 60,000 men per battle. Now that's 200 to 300,000 people right off the bat. The Russian military doesn't count these numbers when they talk about their casualties. Wagner was a private military company, and therefore the numbers of Wagner dead aren't incorporated into overall Russian numbers. So it's not that the Russians are lying, they're just not reflecting that. The same thing with the casualties of the Lugansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic. These people were, put in heavy fighting, and they suffered casualties that go unreported in the overall Russian numbers. But, what we have right now is a situation where even Russia, which, was having extremely favorable kill ratios because of, the surge of drones that the Ukrainians are bringing to bear on the battlefield right now. Russia is suffering casualties. Nowhere near the numbers that Petraeus talks about. Russia's advantages, though, have gone from, say, 12-1, meaning that for every one Russian killed, 12 Ukrainians are killed. Now we're looking at 2 or 3 to 1. So for every, a Russian killed, 2 or 3 Ukrainians are killed. But the Russians are killing on a daily basis, 2,000 Ukrainians. On a good day for Russia, on a bad day for Russia, they're killing, 1,000 Ukrainians. But that means that if it's a 2-to-1 ratio, that means 500 Russians are dying as well. That's a lot of Russians. The Russians are recruiting about 30 to 40,000 guys a month. So their forces are getting stronger, but they are taking casualties. I mean, there's just no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And the casualties depend too, because we're talking about a new kind of warfare. And one of the things that I was able to ascertain is that drone warfare has gotten ahead of the training of many Russian units. The officers continue to use old tactics, and so they are encouraging more heavy infantry assaults in an environment where FPV drones are flying around. And the good commander knows that this can't happen. You have to change your tactics. You have to use counter drone tactics. You have to factor in things that you didn't factor in before. People like Abdi Aladinov, who's the commander of the Akhmat Special Forces. Here's a man who knows modern warfare. His units make impressive advances. They do a good job. Their casualties are relatively low because he cares about the lives of his troops and he understands the role that tactics play in preserving the life of his troops. There's other commanders, in divisions that the soldiers just despise because they order the soldiers to push forward. When the FPV drones are flooding the market, and it's just sending soldiers to their death. If you're out there and you have no ability to bring down FPV drones or to strike back, it's a suicide march. And the Russians are suffering very heavy casualties because some of the commanders just haven't altered their tactics. We're in a sort of a weird transition phase right now where the Russians are learning, but they haven't all learned. They're also, the Russians are developing anti-drone capabilities. I went to, the centers in, for instance, Zaporozhye, where they're, directly supporting frontline units with new technologies, new tactics, et cetera. And they're developing these interceptor drones that are very effective, but you've got to build them to scale. And that takes time and that takes money. And so right now, the Ukrainians sort of have the advantage in terms of drones. There's no doubt about that. But when I say they have the advantage, that doesn't mean they're winning the war. Russia is advancing. Russia is winning. Russia is killing more Ukrainians than they are killing Russians. But the Ukrainians are doing an impressive job. They're making it a very difficult fight for the Russians. But very soon, you're going to see the situation change, because what will happen is that the Russians are now familiar with Ukrainian tactics. They're familiar with their operational procedures, and they're developing weapons and tactics of their own to counter it. And when Russia, they executes these new methodologies, new tactics, use new tools, they'll offset whatever advantage Ukrainians had, and then the Russians will have a stronger advantage, advance even farther until the Ukrainians adapt to the Russians and bring in new technology and make life hard again. It's this continuous cycle of violence, drone-based violence that's going on and on and on. But from an overall perspective, Russia's doing very well, advancing significantly and inflicting horrific casualties on the Ukrainians. But it comes at a heavy price for the Russians as well. David Petraeus is not wrong when he says that the Russians have lost more men dead and wounded